So first things first, who am I? My name's Gordon. At the moment I work for a startup called Rechannel. Been doing that for a few months. Previously I was a team lead at Envica. Before that I was a senior developer at Moo, and before that I did some .NET. You can contact me on these two places. I'm generally not good at responding, but give me a prod, I'll get back to you. But generally, honestly, if you don't get a chance to catch up with me at any point and you do have questions about anything that comes up in these, please feel free to contact me and I'll get back to you and I'll answer you as well as I can. So there's a generally held belief in conference speaking that the bravest or the stupidest thing you can do is a live demo. I believe that I might have found something braver or stupider to do in a room full of PHP developers who are all hungover from a social last night, who are just coming up to their lunch and are going to want to have that. I'm going to talk about golf. Now, I can see some people nervously looking to the door now. I can assure you, you don't need to know a single thing about golf to enjoy this presentation, hopefully. I personally, I am a golfer, I like playing golf, and I started writing a golf application a couple of years ago, not using any of the techniques that I'm about to talk about today, and I recently started rewriting it using a lot of the techniques. So this talk is going to have a little bit of a before and after element to it. I'm going to show you some of the code I did write. I'm going to show you some of the code I have now got. And so, like I say, there's a golf theme to it, but you really don't need to know anything about golf for that. The other thing that I want to make perfectly clear is that I wrote the first version in Kohana, and I'm now working with Symfony. But I want to state for the record that I like Kohana. I think Kohana is a great little framework, so I don't want the takeaway point from this to be some form of framework flame war, like me saying, oh, it's wrong in Kohana and it's right in Symfony. That's not the intent at all. And thirdly, some of the coding examples I'm putting up are a combination of real code, pseudocode, exaggerations for effect, and I will let you decide which you think is which. So we'll start with 2 or 3 just examples of the code as I had it in Kohana. So the first thing we've got here is we've got a club, a golf club. It extends the Kohana ORM, it has a name, it has a golf field where you go out and you play your golf, and it has a course where you would go and learn how to play golf. I can see 1 or 2 golfers shuffling uncomfortably in the seats at some of the terminology there, and I will address that in time. And there's also a function here to be able to book a tee-off time at this club. We also have a simple controller to add a new club. It takes values in from the request, and it saves the club. We have a details controller, does the opposite of that. It takes a club, displays it out. And another controller where we take in the user, we take in a club, we take in a date, and we book a tee-off time for this user. Like I say, the actual things that are happening there is not that important. It's just for illustration, and we'll compare them side by side as we go along. So the first part of this talk is domain-driven design. Can I have a quick show of hands about how many people know and understand that term? Yeah, great. Is there many people in here who don't really know anything about domain-driven design? This is a completely new term to them? Okay. Those people that raised their hands the second time round, are you strong with object orientation? Okay, so I don't think you're going to learn too much new here. There's not going to be anything here that blows your mind in terms of domain-driven design. There's a lot of parallels between DDD and object orientation. So the first thing we're going to look at is the domain. Now, the domain is essentially the sphere of knowledge. It's the thing you're writing your code about. So there's a quote here from Eric Evans, who quite literally wrote the book on this. The book is called Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software. It came out in 2003. And most subsequent writing on the subject comes from this book. It expands on this book. It takes the ideas put forth in this book, and it elaborates on them. But nothing really has changed much since this book. And he says that in order to create good software, you have to know what that software is about, which makes sense, right? You cannot create banking system unless you understand what banking is about. So you must understand the domain of banking to be able to write that. So your domain is a sphere of knowledge or influence or activity. It's what you're doing. It's the subject area to which a user applies a program. And the domain evolves collaboratively. Now, this is a topic I'll come back to again and again over the next 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to spend the first half of this talk, as I say, talking about DDD, some of the principles involved in DDD, and then I'm going to move on to hexagonal architecture. So we have entities and value objects in DDD. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try a little experiment. Does anybody have a £10 note on them? Got a hand up here? I have a £10 note on me. Would you mind swapping your £10 note for my £10 note? Yes. Okay. So you can see here, two £10 notes, two different £10 notes. This one here from the gentleman. This one here was mine. I'm going to take that, and I'm going to swap that. Yep. You happy with that transaction? Yeah. I can feel a sense of anticipation building. I can see people looking, oh, what's happening here? It's a magic trick. It's not. That was exactly as mundane as it looked. But the point is that I have a new £10 note, and you have a new £10 note. But this hasn't changed anything. These £10 notes are equal. They are different, but they're equal. And the equality comes from the values held within. It is 10 and it is pound sterling. And that's how we compare them. These are value objects. Now, I notice there you've got a laptop. You know, we've just established here that, you know, I like to do a trade. I've just done a successful trade. You've seen that. Partner here is happy with the trade. Would you be willing to swap your laptop for my laptop? No, of course not. Of course not. And the reason for that is your laptop has state. Your laptop has the things that you have downloaded into it, your programs, your files, your emails. Mine has state as well. It's got a picture of a train I drew last night. But the concept there is that that is a unique laptop. It is very much your laptop. It is individual. It's not interchangeable. It has, as a value, or sorry, as an entity, it has an ID. It's specific to you. This one has an ID. So the differences there. Value objects are immutable. You don't change them. You know, we didn't upgrade this gentleman's £10 note by changing the picture of the Queen, although you could do that. I wouldn't recommend it. They don't have an identity in this system. They're just, the equality is based on the values of them, whereas the entities do. They contain state. The state changes over time. They describe the current status of the application, and the equality is based on this identifier. I'll have you know, last night when you were all at social, I went and bought that. That's my commitment to a visual gag. So let's talk a little bit about model-driven design. So within the concept of DDD, we have models. Models are the nouns in your domain. Models represent the things you talk about when you talk outside the software, when you're talking with your product owners, when you're talking with your project managers, when you're talking with your clients, whoever it is you interact with, you talk about things. And we want to make sure that we're naming these things as we talk about them outside the software, within the software. And I'm about to come to that in a bit more detail later on. They should be simple. Your models represent nouns, they represent entities, they represent behavior, but they also should adhere to the single responsibility principle. They do one thing. They know about the relationships. If anybody was at Marcelo's talk yesterday, he was talking in a similar vein about models. Complex logic doesn't belong in there. And if you get your model correct, it becomes trivial to enhance the application. You don't need to complete your model at the first pass. You just need to know what it is, how it interacts with certain things, and as your domain grows, you can add new models, you can add new relationships with these models, but it should be quite trivial because these things are small and simple. So let's look back at the code here. We've got our club here, we've got a golf field, and we've got our course, which are strings. We're just having names in these right now. But these are things that we would talk about outside the, in the real world, we would talk about as actual things. A field is a thing, it's not just a string, it's not just a name. So we should split that out and represent that. We have a model now to represent our golf field, and we have a model now to represent our course. And then this becomes represented in our club as well. You'll notice that the string there has changed to the object. Let's talk about ubiquitous language. What this essentially means, and again, this is another quote from Eric Evans, but what this basically means is talk in the same language. Be very, very clear with how you're naming things and make sure that those names represent how people outside of the software talk as well. So we want to remove any ambiguity, any names that have meaning that could mean many things, it could mean depending on who's talking about it. The language should be defined by the domain experts. And one thing to remember, you're not the target audience of your site, in most cases. I know in some cases that will be the case. But crucially, use the same language in the code that you use when you're planning, when you use in discussions, when you're writing. That language should filter across throughout your company. The same thing should be represented everywhere. So one example in my company that we saw, I work in wholesale retail B2B, and in retail B2B, we have the concept of forward orders, and we have the concept of reorders. Now, a forward order is essentially what I would think of as a pre-order. It's something that happens before stock is created. So the retailer, sorry, the brand makes available this stock, says this is the things that are coming. We've not made any yet. We want you to place all your orders so that we know what the demand is so that we can go and make them. And a reorder is what I or any of you would think of as an actual order. They come back after that initial period and they order more. So to a degree, they are reordering. But if you're thinking at it from a B2C point of view, it's an order. You come to the website, you have it there, you press the stock, you go to the order and you place it. And we had countless discussions internally with a couple of developers who were adamant that this was an order. To them, the word reorder made no sense. And in a way, I can understand that. It is an order. And they were thinking purely in that B2C term, and the discussions and the arguments we had, we have to call it an order. This is an order because it makes sense to me. I want to call it an order. And we go back and say, no, we can't call it an order because in our domain experts are talking about a reorder. We have to reflect that. So you've heard me define the term domain experts a couple of times here. I want to do another little experiment here. Can you put up your hand if you own a company, if you run a company, if you manage a company? Can you put up your hand as well if you work in product, you're a product manager, product owner? Can you put up your hands as well if you are a business analyst? Okay. So if you don't have your hand up right now, I hate to break it to you, but you're not the domain expert. Now, at Rechannel, I was lucky enough to be involved at the very start. I architected the system with help from my team, obviously. I have been involved in writing or reviewing pretty much every line of code. I understand implicitly the relationships between all the entities within our system. I know the domain. But a lot of our clients are brands in women's wear. I don't understand why retail buyers come to our system and they order lots of this and none of this. I don't understand when our brands are putting together their collections, that this season everything has to be blue and polka dots. I don't understand why handbags cost £500 when I paid £30 for that one and it carries more. I'm not the domain expert. I understand the domain in terms of software, but I'm not the domain expert. So let's look back at our code here. When I wrote this code, I was thinking about it from my point of view. A course to me is something you go on to learn. So it makes sense to call that thing a course. And a golf field, it makes sense. That's where you go and you go play. You play golf on the field. So I'm going to name these this way because that's what makes sense to me as a developer. Obviously, this is an awkward example because I'm the developer and the product owner and everything, but run with me here. So I've chosen as a developer to name things this way because it makes sense to me as a developer. Now imagine what happens when the product owner comes to me and says, okay, we need to change the cost of the course. And I look at it and go, okay, when you say course, do you mean the course you mean, or do you mean the course I mean? This should reflect across the entire business. The words in the software need to represent the words outside of the software. So I'm going to talk about bounded context a little bit here. What a bounded context essentially is, it's a subdivision of your domain. So we spoke about your domain being your sphere of influence. It's everything about your business. But you can sometimes segregate that more. So to keep the golf analogy going, imagine we have a greenkeeper who's responsible for maintaining the golf course itself. We have the club pro who's responsible for giving the lessons. In the greenkeeper, they have a lot of tools, for example, that they would use. They're going to have a lawnmower. They're going to have all the tools they need to cut the grass, to do everything they need to do. These things are very, very specific to that small area of the domain. You know, the club pro is not going to come along and start using the lawnmower. Could if they wanted to, but we've got this little bounded context here that is for them. Likewise, the pro, they're going to have their teaching calendar. They're going to have a set of people they've had lessons with before and after. They're going to have the inventory of the club shop. Usually the club pro runs the club shop. So bounded contexts can have unrelated concepts. You've got the teaching calendar, you've got the lawnmower on one side, but they can also share concepts. So think of the course, for example. The club pro is going to go and play on the course, and the greenkeeper is going to maintain the course. But what we've got to be wary of is that words and phrases mean different things in different contexts. So just without any context whatsoever, if I say the word ticket, what does that mean to you? I can guarantee there's about 4 or 5 different things going around the room at the moment. Everybody's got a different thing because I've not put any context on it whatsoever. So think of, and again, to go back to our golf example, think of a bunker. To those that aren't proficient golf or don't know that much about golf, a bunker is basically an obstacle on the golf course that's filled with sand. If you are the club pro, the bunker, it's annoying. It's a thing that's there that when you're playing golf, you sometimes land in and you have to get out of it. It's a value object because it doesn't matter which bunker you're in as a pro, just you're in a bunker. But if we think of it from the point of view of the greenkeeper, it's that specific bunker. It suffers with drainage in the winter, for example, and it tends to flood, or the grass around the lip of it is too long. To the greenkeeper, these things are very specific. So things mean different things in different contexts. Okay. So services. Services are the actions in your application. We spoke about the nouns before. We've built our models. Services are the actions when something has to do something. Services cause state changes to entities, but they do not have state themselves. And we're still being driven by the same principles that we've just spoken about, ubiquitous language and domain expertise. We still need to make sure we're having that discussion. When something happens in our system, we have a service, it represents a real-world need that's spoken about. So let's look back at our model here, our club. We've got an action we want to perform here, which is booking a tee-off time for a user. You notice the name of that function doesn't actually involve the word club, and it's interacting with a number of different things. It's not really affecting the state of the club. It does depend on how you've modeled it. If the club has a series of tee-off times within it, then perhaps. But how I would prefer to look at this is, let's create a booking service. And we have a manager for booking tee times where we pass a user and a club into it. Now within this booking service, which is namespaced off, we could also have a restaurant booking manager. Many golf clubs have restaurants as part of the complex. So continuous integration. We'll move on to next. CI is was spoken about by Javi. Did anybody go to Javi's talk yesterday? Well, he was talking about continuous deployment, whereas I'm stopping at the first one of continuous integration here. Your domain is constantly going to evolve. It's going to change, it's going to shift as you move into slightly different spheres of influence. What was right isn't going to be right anymore. We need to maintain discussion. We need to take that step back and don't just furiously code. Let's take a step back and see, is this changing anything that we used to take for granted? Testing strategies will help flag changes to this. If you are using, for example, PHP spec to build your domain, and you have it making a certain set of expectations, and somebody changes the domain, your tests are going to break, and that's a good point where you can look at it and go, oh, do we want to break these tests at this point? Is this a change we want to make, or is this an accidental change? But mainly, merge code quickly and often. If you have two teams running off in different directions, writing code, the domain is going to shift. They're going to make certain changes. It might be subtle, it might be big. But if you come 6 months later and try to merge that code back in, when two teams have started going in that direction, it's going to be hard. You should always look to keep changes small, iterative, merge quickly, merge often. So these are just a few tips that I've had from the successful application of DDD with the projects I've worked on. So crucially, build models as a collaboration. This isn't just product owner, product manager, business analyst comes to you and says, I want this, go and do it. This is a collaborative process between both teams to work out how to approach this. The domain experts know how it works in the real world. You know how it works in the software world. Come together and work out the best way to make that work so that we can apply the principles we've just spoken about. Build your application iteratively, small chunks. We don't need to solve this problem. Again, Marcelo spoke about this last night, big design up front. Accept your domain will evolve and change. You don't have to get this absolutely spot on first time. Have complete access to a domain expert. This is one of the most key things that I've found in successful projects is when somebody who's invested in the delivery of the project is available 90–95% of the time, it's easy because you can ask them questions. Did you mean this? Is this what you want? I'm not sure what this means. Can you clarify it for me? If you don't have that, you're guessing. If you're guessing, like I said before, you're not the domain expert, and you're going to probably guess wrong. And I think Marcelo's going to kick my ass for this one. Test. If you can, so what Marcelo spoke about yesterday is what you're not doing. You're not testing, you're speccing. And I do agree with that, but the output of speccing is that you have a test suite. If you can write these tests up front as you go along, that'll be brilliant because, like we just said, if you have a breaking change and it is reflected in a test that breaks, then that will be flagged up very quickly and you can see, did we mean to do this? Do we want to change the behavior of this domain? Or is that accidental? So if you take nothing else from this talk, if there's only one tip you take Please let it be that. Talk with each other. So why are we not all doing this? Why do we don't all just, well, it's the future. I use the word downside here. I don't necessarily believe that is true. That's why I use ish. But there is no doubt it's time consuming, especially initially, to set this up, to start changing your mentality, to start changing your thinking, to put the infrastructure in place, to start putting testing mechanisms in place up front, to start putting enhanced discussions there. It's time consuming. But you notice the star there, it's time consuming initially, but this pays itself back manifold towards the middle and end of a project. It can be confusing if you don't understand the domain. We just spoke about orders versus reorders versus forward orders. If a new developer comes into this system, you've got your language, you've got your way of speaking, they're not going to understand it necessarily at first. You have to take the time to educate them, to bring them up to speed so that they understand what you're talking about. And there is an overhead in maintaining constant dialogue. A lot of your managers, your bosses will think, okay, you're a developer, you sit there for 8 hours a day, head down, code away. If you're having discussions, you're not delivering anything. Again, to me, that's not a downside. I can see why it could be perceived as, but having that discussion means you're more likely to get it right first time. Okay, so we have now evolved our code from the first iteration. We've got it now nicely cut off into a domain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about geometry. So what are we trying to achieve with hexagonal architecture? There's a quote there from Alistair Cockburn, who is kind of the authority on this. If you've not read his blog, then it's the first one that comes up when you type hexagonal architecture, and it's well worth a read. He says, allow an application to be equally driven by users, programs, automated tests, or batch scripts, and to be developed and tested in isolation from its eventual runtime devices and databases. Obviously. What does that actually mean? It means that if you split your domain well enough, then there's going to be many things in the outside world that want to interact with it. You're going to want to retrieve data from multiple sources, perhaps. You have an XML reader, you have an HTML front end, you have an API, and you may need to output data to multiple sources. You could be using Mongo, you could be using Redis, you could be using MySQL. Doesn't matter inside your domain. Your domain does not care. Your domain cares about, I have this object and I want it persisted. That's all I care about. And this is the question that I anticipated would come up most often than not. The hexagon is not a hexagon because the number 6 is important. It could be pentagonal architecture, octagonal architecture, dodecahedronagonal architecture. But rather to allow people doing the drawing to have room to insert ports and adapters as they need, not being constrained by a one-dimensional layered diagram. So traditionally this would be viewed left to right, top to bottom. And the hexagon just gives it a visual effect. So this is another image that came from Alistair Cockburn's blog. You can see we speak traditionally, and again, to reference Marcelo's talk yesterday, he spoke about abstractions, deal with abstractions, and push the concretions down and away. If you were at that, you remember that slide, top left, push the concretions down and away. What I'm saying is basically the same thing, but I'm saying push them out and away. Your application, he uses the word application here, this is what we've just described as a domain, sits in the middle here, and push the concretions outside of it. So let's look back at our club. We're extending the ORM in the club here. This is the way that Kohana uses ORM to give you essentially active records. What this means, and I apologize for this diagram. I had a friend that helped me write most of the slides, so they look generally quite nice because he's good at that kind of thing. I had to do this myself. It kind of shows. But the principle of the thing is we want all the dependency arrows to flow inwards. And just actually one thing that may be slightly confusing, you'll notice here, there's 2 hexagons, and you'll notice here, there's 2 hexagons. My outer hexagon here represents his inner hexagon, just to confuse you even more, obviously. This isn't necessarily something that you would need to do or want to do. I just prefer to do it that way. I like to split the domain models inside and put the services wrapped around that, and then put the application layer around about that, and that's the outer hexagon that Alistair Cockburn talks about. So you see we've got our controllers coming in through the managers, through our services. The services come in towards our models. Everything's great so far, that's what we want to see. But the red arrows there, they're coming back out now. Kahana now lives within our domain and is important within our domain. And we don't want that to be the case. So let's talk about ports. If you noticed on the first slide, when I mentioned hexagonal architecture, it also said ports and adapters. Ports and adapters is just a different term for that. So ports are the gateways into your domain. They define the purpose of the conversation. So like I mentioned before, you know you want to store data somewhere, but your domain doesn't care where. So if we have another quick look at this diagram here, the lines, the bold lines where it says database, notifications, where it says user data, where it says administration, these are the ports in our application here. Or, sorry, that's confusing because he uses application in our system here. What the ports are for is to say, okay, you can save data. I'm the database port, and I will give you the contract of how to save data. But how you then use that is up to you. So let's illustrate that with a little bit of code. So I've got my club now, and what I'm building is a club repository. The club repository is this contract now. It says, if you want to persist a club, then you have to adhere to the rules applied by this port. You can save a club, and you can find a single club by its ID. That's all you can do. I don't care how you do it. I don't care where you put it. But that's the 2 things you can do. And now we look at our club. So we are no longer using Kahana ORM, so we need to build in a constructor now, which came for free previously. But nothing much more has changed. We still got our simple club. I've started namespacing a little bit here, just to help the illustration, but it's not overly important for this example. But the important point is we now get a constructor, we build our club, but a club doesn't know how to save itself. I missed a code. I wanted to put another slide in here that I forgot to put in. I apologize. Our constructor, originally, no, I'm not going to go back to it. We were calling club save. The club knew how to save itself, and this came from the ORM. And that showed the arrow flowing back outwards. The club knew about application logic. Now we don't have that. Now we pass a club into the repository that knows how to save itself. So we've got our ports. So the second part of this contract is adapters. Adapters are built on top of the ports, and they provide functionality concretely. And you can have multiple adapters. You probably will have multiple adapters. So, for example, here's a very specific adapter. We implement the club repository. We're using the ports. We're using that set of rules we've defined. And through space, obviously, I've commented it out, but that would be some SQL that would save a club, some SQL to find a club and return it. I want to save it in Mongo. Same port, same simplistic, I can save it, I can find it. And that's your Mongo language to save those, or to find one by ID. And so a major advantage of this is if you wanted to swap your storage mechanism out from MySQL to Mongo for some reason, that's how easy it is. slightly trivializes it, obviously, but your domain doesn't care. Your domain doesn't change. No behavior has changed at all in your domain. You just build another adapter, configure it to use that adapter now, and you're now using Mongo. So we've got a file system club repository. This is how we test. We build, we use Behat, and we use file system. So when we configure, when Behat spins up, instead of configuring the MySQL adapter, it configures the file system adapter. It's quicker. We don't need to go near the database when we're running our test suite. We've just got an adapter. Same contract. We're still using the club repository. We've still got just our two simple methods. And now we go back to the controller here. So where I did have, as I just mentioned, that save function, now we're passing the club into the club repository, and we're saving it that way. We've defined our contract. So now we look a little bit like this in the hexagon. So these two repositories, the club repository and the teatime repository, are now the ports into our system. Anything that wants to save anything into a data storage has to come through these repositories. And you'll notice that we've got a Redis one and a MySQL one coming through there, depending on how we configure it, depending on what we're running at any given time. But you'll see the red line here. The create club controller is still going directly into our domain. It still knows how to manipulate. If you go back a slide here, we're still creating a new club directly. We need a port at the other side here. So we've got a club porter. I use the word porter because it's to do with the import and export of data in and out the system to the UI, so it's portation, it's a porter. We've defined two rules. You can either import a club with mixed data, depending on where it's coming from, or you can export a club, which takes a club and exports mixed data. So let's see a concrete realization of that. We've got a request club porter. Takes in a request, builds our club from the information, and we can export a club by taking the club, putting the data into the response and returning that. As I said before, some of the code examples are pseudocode just for illustration rather than real genuine code. But the advantage we have here is that same thing. We don't want to take in a request anymore. We want to take in JSON. We want to take in HTML. We want to take in XML. So let's go back to our controller now. All of a sudden, I've got a one-line controller. Data comes in through the porter. Data gets saved through the repository. Domain doesn't care where it's coming from. Domain doesn't care where it's going to. So this gives us, it expands the diagram a little bit here, and now we can see the flow of arrows is all coming in. The users, the clubs, the models, they don't care where the data is coming from. They don't care how they're made. They don't care anything. The services don't care where the data comes from. They know what they have to do. And the concrete implementations are based on configuration. So what sort of ports should there be? Traditionally, in a web application, you're not going to need that many. Alistair Cockburn, when he originally wrote his slides, he was dealing in enterprise software, big behemoth systems, and he said he'd never seen more than 4. Traditionally, as I say, in a web app, you're not going to see much more than a couple. Data comes in and out to screen, to UI, data gets persisted into a database. You could maybe have logging ports, notification ports if you needed that. But the hexagon, as I say, is not, you don't need to have 6 ports. There aren't 6 defined ports. It's just an illustration of a number of ports. Okay. Thank you for your time. Like I say, if you do have any further questions on this and you do want to try and contact me and you don't get a chance to see me today, then please feel free to contact me through those places. And that's a reference to the book that Eric Evans wrote. The second link is it's a PDF that summarizes the book. I built a lot of the first part of the talk on that. And that's Alistair Cockburn's blog on hexagonal architecture is worth reading as well. Yeah, if there's any questions.
There it is.
I go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So, am I going first? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Gordon, why would you suggest for a team, so if you're team leading a team and some of the people in the team still not up to speed with DDD, how do you recommend the team lead to kind of bring them up to speed? What kind of things did you
Well, the main thing I would suggest, did everybody hear the question okay? It's how to introduce new team members to TDD or to DDD. The main thing is, as I say, like the main point I put across, it's communication. Take the time. The domain language you use is going to become second nature to you. You're going to refer to things without thinking about it. So it's a slow process. You have to go through with them. You have to make sure they're involved in a lot of meetings with you. So don't split out the meetings into, well, these two guys know about this, so they're going to sit and have this discussion and nobody else is going to know. Try and involve as many people as you can in those discussions when you're talking about domain objects, when you're talking about models, when you're talking about behaviors of the domain, so that it becomes second nature to people over time, that they'll start picking it up. In terms of the techniques, you can use certain things. You can use pairing with more senior developers who do understand it, code reviews, helping pick out maybe places they've gone wrong, sit with them, help them understand, okay, I see what you were trying to do there, but maybe, we try to approach a problem this way, help them understand why to do that. But it's just continuously working with them and investing that time. Like I said, there is some overheads, and this is an overhead that's worth it. Invest the time. Team lead may have to take a cut in how much they can actually deliver during that. They're maybe not doing so much programming during that time. But if they invest the time, then the team as a whole grows through that. Does that help?
Hi. Could you come back to your hexagonal row?
This one here.
Yeah. My question is, if you talk about your code domain, so why the service is out of this domain, of this core, sorry?
They are not. So this was what I spoke about when I said it was maybe slightly confusing between the two diagrams. My core domain here is the outer hexagon, and I split the inner hexagon to be the domain models. Yeah. But the outer hexagon is the domain, so the domain still contains the services.
But if you could go to the controller, please. 1 second. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're calling here direct to the repository, and I don't know why you're doing this instead of calling from your service, that it's from your domain. I mean, if you have the interface, you only need the implementation in the controller.
Yes. Absolutely right, and this is a conversation I had about half an hour ago myself, before I started myself. You would perhaps want to, so what I'm trying to illustrate mainly here is the data comes in a format. It comes through a porter, which is defined by the port, and it's now in your domain, and it goes out through a repository, through a specific one. So that's the layer I'm trying to enhance, to show here. I'm using a controller as, because we're generally web developers here, so we do use controllers. But what you might want to do is abstract that knowledge into the domain as well. Have a service that deals with converting the data from the controller into the format that your concrete adapter would then use in the domain in that model. So yes, perhaps that's maybe not clear. And the other thing that, to follow up on the point you just mentioned there that I was thinking is that the controller here points at the porter, but if you actually look at the code, it also comes around the other side and points at the repository as well. So the controller itself doesn't quite fit this model. I tried to draw it in here just for illustration that it's there. What you would maybe want to do is have another service, like you say, inside the domain that that converts the data through the controller. We would use a param converter, for example, to do that, and use that process.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. The controller
we can
doesn't.
talk later
Yeah.
if
The
you-
controller doesn't quite fit the model. I agree with what you're saying there. But the important part I was trying to illustrate was data's coming in one format. You use a concrete implementation of a port to get it into your domain.
Okay. Thank you.
One over here. One over there, yeah? Good to you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, I work in a large organization with different teams in different countries, for example. So the bounded context stuff is quite interesting. Have you got any advice on how that scales and what are the artifacts and agreements that you end up with?
Not great advice because I work in a startup. I work in a very small code base. How I would have approached, or how I approached that within our system is through namespacing, and so you split it out that way. But it's not a problem, to be honest, that I've solved myself, because generally speaking, a lot of the code bases I work with are quite small. They are quite contained. They're not as sprawling, unfortunately. So I don't have that much advice that I could give you there.
Okay, I have one other question. We've used a lot of terms like value objects, models, services, and then overlapping that with standard MVC web frameworks. So could you give like a summary of how these things map or where they don't map well?
That would be a talk in itself, I think, to do it properly. But like I said at the start, in terms of OO design, most of us are relatively au fait with that. You know, your models map to your objects. So the concepts do cross over. In terms of MVC, you're seeing we're still using a controller. The model becomes the domain, really. You're working with the full domain, even if you're only using parts of it. The view is coming through the port, so you're using your porter to export data. You might have an HTML porter that ports to that. You might use an API to export the information out that a front end can then consume. So the V is almost irrelevant in MVC with this hexagonal architecture. You output your models in a way, and how the front end would then consume that is up to it. In terms of OO, like I say, much of the structure is the same. You have objects that interact with each other. The principles of keep your objects small still apply. The principles of dealing with abstractions, encapsulation, they all still apply. So there's not a huge shift in mentality required to start thinking in terms of DDD. The biggest shift is the conversational aspect of it and understanding that there are people employed in your organization who do know the domain better than you, so let them help you.
For example, in your diagram, which ones are the services, which ones are the entities, where are the models in that?
What I've tried to do with this diagram, if you can bring it back up onto the screen, please, is the color code here. So the inner hexagon are my models. Those are the simple objects. There's club, there's course. They can interact with each other. The club knows about the course. The second layer, color-coded in green, these are our services that interact directly with our models, but you notice that our models don't interact backwards with the services. And then external to the hexagon, so this goes into our application layer, start dealing with the services themselves.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you.
Yeah, hi there. Great talk. Interested when you're talking about the naming, and say later down the line the domain experts realise they've made a mistake and a user should be called a player. Would you go to the extent of renaming all the users in the code to players?
Ideally, yes, I would, but there has to be a time and place for it. I'm not generally a fan of refactoring for refactoring stopping and just having, we're just going to do code now. I do believe in always moving the business objective forward. So at a point where it made sense to do that, I would do it, but the short answer is yes, I would advocate doing that.
One more about naming, which seems to be very important. If you're coming from a design pattern background, you will most likely use a lot of names like this is something factory or observer or anything. Would this conflict with using domain-based naming, or do they work together because they don't apply to actually the same entities?
I believe that you can, and you'll notice I use the word collaboratively quite often. It's not necessarily the fact that you have to adhere to what your domain expert says, because you guys are the technical experts, and there is a middle ground. You should always try as much as you can to name things as things are going to be named, but it might not always be possible. There might be ways of naming things. You might call something, for example, a factory or an observer. That's perfectly okay, as long as there's still a description that maps to the outside world.
Hi there. Do you have any advice for structuring the application? Do you have like a domain, a namespace for your models and your services, or do you mix them together?
How I tend to do it is at the root source folder. I would have namespaces for each of my domain models. So a user, I would have a club. Course would maybe live within club. The services live at that level as well, but you'll notice if I go back, I use the word service there. The services live within there, but they live at the same level. Like I say, this is personal preference. I'm not saying that this is necessarily right or wrong. And then we have a folder as well at that level called infrastructure, and our Doctrine lives in there, our Symfony lives in there, all our controllers live in there that are essentially outside our domain. So the three layers live at the same layer within the code. You could, what I have done in the past, is split out the model layer into its own subdomain as well. So you have model/user/user, model/club/course. It's partially down to personal preference, I think. But as long as there is a clear distinction to you, and it makes obvious to you and your team, then I think there are ways to do it that suit you. That's just how we choose to do it.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Okay. We're done. Okay, thank you, everybody.